So the first step when we're starting a new example is to create a place to house it. So I'm really gonna keep beating this idea that we want to create a folder to put our project in and then save our FLA file inside of that rather than just, saving things willy-nilly on the desktop or whatever, because there's so many, again, files that go together in this. So I'm just gonna go to my desktop and I'm gonna make a new folder. All right, so we're gonna make this project called animation. So I, again, like to make a folder with uppercase animation, and then I will create a new document. So I'm gonna go to create new inside of Animate. And it should already have these document settings saved if you chose make default last time. But just in case not, we want to make sure that our new document is HTML5 Canvas, and we want to make sure that the width is 960, the height is 540, and the frame rate is 30. All right, so again, 960 by 540, and then at 30 frames per second. And that should all already be like this. I'll show you how to set it to default if you didn't last time once we open it up. So I'm going to create the document. And then if I look at my properties panel over here on the right, and this very first more settings under the, the second more settings under the document settings where it says 960 by 540 has our 30 frames per second. If I click more settings, you can click on make default right here. That'll make sure that it saves that for next time. So do that if you haven't already. 960 by 540, 30 frames per second. And then I typically, when I'm working, I set my stage to either black or like a muted gray or something like that, but I'll leave it as white for right now, just so you can kind of see the boundaries here. All right, so once I have this document set up, now I want to save the actual FLA file and save it inside of the folder. So I'm just gonna go to File, Save, and that's going to open my thing up here. So I'm going to get to my desktop, my animation folder. I'm going to save a animation.fla inside of here. All right, so while you guys are setting that up, let me talk a little bit briefly about some animation history and how some of these terms came to be. Back in what they would consider the golden era of animation, when Disney was drawing everything on actual pieces of paper and celluloid and whatnot back in the 1930s, there's certain nomenclature that still lives from that time that works itself into most computer animation programs, all right? So one thing is the idea of a frame, okay? You all probably understand what a frame means, like in a video, one individual spot of the video, animation frames. Back when they were making the Disney feature films, they would actually, the film standard, which it still is today, is 24 frames per second. They would actually draw, they would animate 12 frames per second, and they would double up and just show each frame twice and to fill out that full 24. But that 12 frames a second is really kind of about the minimum fluidity that you can get for your eye to kind of fill in the missing pieces and see the motion. But what they would do, because they obviously didn't have little computer servants to do their drawing for them, is they would have what they considered the masters, the older animators who have been doing it forever, or at least started it or whatever, and they would create what were called the keyframes. Is they would draw, for example, if they're drawing like a Donald Duck walk cycle or something like that, they would draw just the certain frames, like not 12 per second, but maybe only 1 or 2 per second, just what they would consider to be the key frames that were necessary to show the action, the emotion, everything involved with the scene to really get that out of the character. And then they would hand off what they called the in-between frames to lesser animators or interns or whatever you want to call it. And that started to get shortened from in-betweens to just tweens and tweeners. So when I say the word tween, I'm not talking about like a prepubescent pop star, but the in-between individual frames. And what we do with computer graphics and computer animation, these terms still live, that we have our main stage that we put everything on. And along our timeline down here, which I'm going to show you how it works in a minute, we create frames to work with, and then we'll actually set keyframes to be the ones that, okay, this is the position that's really important that I actually have to save. And then instead of having interns do the work for us, we can actually tell the computer to create a tween in between two keyframes, and that will automatically fill in the motion in between them. So let me show you how that works. There's just a little bit of background. We're talking about frames and keyframes and tweens. All this does come from the original animation industry. So looking down here at the timeline, let's start by just drawing something to move around. You can make whatever you want. I'm just going to draw a shape. I'm going to keep it very simple and just draw a little red ball. So I am selecting the oval tool, and I'm looking at my tool panel over here, my properties, and I'm making sure that it doesn't really matter, but just to keep it simple, I'm having no stroke by selecting this little crossed out white box for stroke, and then I'm just having the red color for the fill. And when I draw my oval, I'm going to hold the shift key so it draws a circle rather than an oval. So I have this ball. All right, and like we went through last time with symbols, before I make a symbol out of it, the ball is just a shape on the stage. So I could, in theory, select part of it and separate it. All right, now there are two golden rules in Animate for creating animation. The two golden rules are, number one, the object that you want to animate has to be a symbol first. Okay, so we must create a symbol before we just start creating keyframes and tweens. The other golden rule is that it must be on its own layer. So if you're trying to move a bunch of things around, each separate thing that you want to move has to be on its own layer and has to be a symbol. All right, so right now we only have one object, so that should be relatively easy. It's already the only thing on its layer. Let's go ahead and create a symbol out of it. So I want you to select the object that you've drawn on the screen, whether it's a little ball or not. Make sure that you get the whole thing. Make sure that if, for example, you drew a shape with a stroke around it, that you don't accidentally just click in the middle and select only the middle and not the stroke around it, because then you'll end up making a symbol that doesn't include all of the elements on that layer, and we'll run into problems with animation later. So two ways to be sure and select everything that you have on that layer. One, you can just use the region select to drag around things, or you can click on the little keyframe on frame one right there with a little black circle, and that'll select everything on it. So once it's selected, now we want to make a symbol out of it. And like I talked about before, there's several ways to do it. You can do it through modify, convert to symbol. You can right click and you can do convert to symbol. I personally use the hotkeys. I use the F8 hotkey, which I can just press, and that brings up the convert to symbol dialog box. Or new in Animate 2020, there's actually a convert to symbol icon over here on the properties panel that has like a little arrow pointing to a clover or something. So however you do it, you want to open up the convert to symbol dialog box, and we want to make sure that this is a graphic symbol. That's all we're going to be dealing with right now with animating is graphic symbols, and we want to give it a name. So I'm just going to name mine ball. You hit OK. And now my ball is a symbol. So I can select part of it and it won't let me separate it. It's just one symbol altogether. Now in my library, if I take a peek at that, I've got my graphic symbol, have my ball here ready. And because the two golden rules, again, I'll say it again, one golden rule before we animate anything is that it must be a symbol first. Check, we've done that. The other golden rule is that it must be the only thing on the layer, meaning we couldn't have 2 or 3 symbols all on the same layer and expect to animate them all separately or even individually without chaos ensuing. So because this is the only thing drawn, we also have that checked. But one thing that I really like to do is, because we match up one layer per symbol for the most part, I like to name the layer what the symbol is. So I'm just going to double click on the layer name and change that to be named ball as well. So easy enough. We haven't done anything new yet. Just a lot of explanation, setting up a single little circle ball object on the screen. Everybody with me so far? All right. So next, let's talk about the timeline down here. Now, Animate is a little odd compared to any other animation program that I've worked with. I've worked with half a dozen different 3D animation programs: Maya, Softimage, 3ds Max, Modo, all that stuff. Worked with the Adobe animation programs, After Effects and Premiere for video, several other different animation programs. And for some reason, Animate is kind of the only one I've ever seen that doesn't just start with infinite time for you just to start with. You have to actually create frames on the timeline for time to be able to pass. It's kind of an interesting step that is unique to Animate, but it is a step that we have to make. And later on, as we get into more interactive stuff, it may make a little more sense as to why it's this way. But this is the first step, is that right now we just have one frame. You can see along the timeline, you can see that it counts up. You can see where it will show you a little 1 second mark and 2 second mark at frames 30 and frames 60, because we have 60 frames a second, or 30 frames a second. But we have this little blue kind of vertical line tab thing that we should be able to click on and drag throughout the timeline, but we can't move it yet. We can't do anything until we actually add some frames, all right? And that's gonna be the first step. So first thing I want you to do is I want you to select frame 30 on the timeline. It should highlight blue on your actual ball layer. Just select frame 30, and we're going to add a frame. Now, once again, there are probably at least 3 or 4 ways to be able to add a frame. You can do it through the top menu. If you want to click once and say insert, click again timeline, and then you can go to frame. But notice there's a little F5 right here. You could also right click on the frame and choose insert frame. And then let's see, on the properties panel, I don't see the button there. Oh, there is also a button up here. There's a button on the timeline that has a little fly out arrow that has just a square with a black circle in it. And the default is keyframe, but you can see there's also blank keyframe and frame under there. So we're not dealing with keyframes yet. We're just trying to add frames. So you could add your frame that way. I stick to hotkeys. Again, having used this program for literally decades, and I've spent weeks and weeks at a time in a cubicle using this program, just building things fast and furious, and getting used to some hotkeys and some keyboards will just save you so much time. So I just use the hotkey. Before we used F8 to create a symbol. F5 is the hotkey for creating frames. Now, as I continue in this class, I'm just going to reference the keyframe or the hotkeys when I'm creating keyframes and or frames and keyframes and removing them, because that's the way I work, and it's much faster than clicking on the interface once you kind of get used to it. But there are certain situations, like for example, if you're on a tablet, that is a little more difficult to pull up the keyboard than it is just to click something on the screen. That's a reason why you might want to. You can use either the right-click menu or the pull-down menu or the actual icon, but just be sure that for this part, you're actually using the frame icon and not keyframe, right? So whichever way you want to do it, you can go ahead and add frames basically out to frame 30. And as soon as you've done that, you'll see that light gray area kind of fill in. And now you can take the little blue needle or arrow, what it's actually called is a playhead, is you can take the playhead and you can click it and you can drag it all the way around from frame 1 to frame 30. So just take a moment, add your frames, drag that thing around, and see how there's even like a little frame indicator up there in the timeline to show you exactly which frame you're on, that you could click in and change and have it jump right to the right frame. So just take a moment to familiarize yourself with that. Easy enough. Now, I'm just going to push on. Everything that we create inside of Animate, it's also just as important to figure out how to uncreate it or destroy it or delete it or whatever. And let me show you what I mean. So let's actually start with the symbol. This will come back at a different time. It's not as relevant to what we're doing right now. But because I'm going to show you how to remove keyframes the same way I showed you to add keyframes, I want to show you how you can unsymbol something, right? So I have this ball symbol in my library, and I can select it. And if I wanted to edit it, sure, I could double click on it to go inside of that symbol area. I can edit the raw shape. But let's say for whatever reason, maybe I wasn't going to animate it. I just didn't want this ball symbol anymore. Or maybe, for example, here, go ahead and just watch my screen for a moment. You don't have to do this part. I just want to show you how it works before we get into the removing frames. But if I were to, for example, have two different copies of this ball symbol on that I dragged from the library, one of them, maybe I want to change color on just one of them. If I were to go inside of this symbol and try and change the color, it's going to change on both of them because they're both copies of the same symbol, right? So one of these, if I wanted to kind of unsymbol this and turn it back into a shape, there's a command called break apart. So I could right click and find, and find break apart or command B, or I could go and modify the same place where I created the symbol and choose break apart. And all that does is just take whatever symbol it was, and it doesn't delete it from the library or anything like that. It just takes what was on stage and takes whatever was inside of the symbol and kind of brings it up to the surface and gets rid of the symbol. So now that I have one that's the actual symbol that's in my library, and then I have one that's a raw shape that I could take pieces of and I can change colors, right? So we can create symbols and uncreate symbols by using break apart. Now, in the same sense, we can create frames by using F5. I want to point this out again with the hotkeys because, again, I think it's much, much, much faster and easier if you actually have a keyboard to use the hotkeys as we go on than continuously click on little icons. I'm sitting on a Mac, and I just have to open up my system preferences. I showed you this before, but I'll show you again. In keyboard, and I have to click on this check mark, use F1, F2, etc. keys as standard function keys. And then I don't have to hold the FN key as I use these function keys, and they'll do what I actually want them to. That might be a little different based on your setup. Some of the newer Macs that have the kind of track bar across the top, you have different options in there, but ultimately you should be able to kind of pick through it and figure out. Sorry, it's my phone ringing in the background, very exciting. You should be able to kind of figure out how to use those function keys. So I'll start with the function keys. That's the way I know how to do it. But with F5, just adding frames, if I want to select frame 60, I can hit F5, poof. Now I've got frames out to frame 60. Now, if I want to remove frames, I can select. So maybe I'll drag a selection from 60 back to 31 here. If I want to get rid of those, I can do Shift F5. So F5 adds frames, and then Shift F5 will remove frames, and that just got rid of them. So now let me see, how do I remove frames? If I want to bring this back down to like 15, if I'm using the interface, I can right-click my selection, and I can remove frames, all right? So you can see that's in the right-click menu. It also has this little arrow which denotes the Shift button in F5, and it shows you these hotkeys. Let me see if this little icon down here. All right, so using this little icon down here does not give you the ability to remove frames through it. So you would have to either use the right-click menu or go down into the insert timeline. I'm not even sure how you would remove frames. You might just have to use the right-click menu if you don't want to use hotkeys, but I would recommend just using F5 and Shift F5. So you can do this in different ways beyond just selecting a particular frame to go out to and hitting F5. Whoops. You can also just, without actually selecting a frame later on, you could just have the playhead sitting in any old area within your timeline, and you could just start pressing F5 repeatedly, and it'll just add frames one at a time for you right where you're adding. And then similarly, you could sit there and hold Shift and keep hitting F5, and it'll take them away. Now that's only one at a time. I can make selections and do this with more than one frame at a time. So for example, I could go ahead and select like 10 or 11 frames here, and then if I just keep pressing F5, it's going to add that many frames each time. So like one thing that might make sense, for example, maybe I'll select an entire second of time, and then each time I hit F5, it's just going to add a second of time each time. Or then if I hit Shift F5, it's going to start removing that. All right. So easy enough. That's how we create. Now I want you to set yourself up. Let's go with 2 seconds of animation. So go out to frame 60 and make sure that your frames are just set at 2 seconds. But be very clear that as much as you're going to want to add frames, you also want to be able to understand how to remove frames as well. All right, so now that we know how to add frames, and now, okay, there's actually time here. Now I want to create keyframes, which are the ones that have a particular motion that we want to register and track. Now we already get one keyframe by default on frame 1. Okay, that's also something that's interesting about this program is it starts on frame 1. A lot of animation programs start on frame 0, which just means that, I don't know, it's subtle when it comes to being exact on a second and things like that. But regardless, we can create a keyframe with a hotkey by using F6. So F5 creates frames, F6 creates keyframes. Or again, you can use the insert menu, you can use this little icon here and put it back on keyframe instead of frame, or you can right click, but it's much faster just to press F6 once you get that set up, and then it will put a new, in fact, I'm going to stick mine, get rid of that, I'm going to stick it on frame 30. So I want you to go ahead and put a keyframe, another keyframe on frame 30, whatever method you choose, and you should see this little black dot show up, and that is your keyframe. All right, now, just like with creating frames, you can remove keyframes by using Shift F6. So I have this keyframe created. In fact, the first time, maybe I accidentally put it on frame 20. I can select it, and once it's selected, I can do Shift F6, and that will get rid of the keyframe. Go back to frame 30, F6, keyframe. I could right-click and choose remove frames. In fact, I think that even, oh no, this is where it gets confusing, because removing frames, that would be like hitting Shift F5. You have to go to clear keyframe in order to get rid of it. And you can see that little Shift F6 here. So again, you can see all of the hotkeys in the right click menu, F5 and Shift F5 for insert frame and remove frame, F6 and Shift F6 for convert to keyframe or clear keyframe. All right, so far we've learned basically 3 hotkeys: F8 to make a symbol, F5 and Shift F5 for frames, F6 and Shift F6 for keyframes. And of course, there's always Command Z or Control Z if you're on Windows for undo, which will go back to like 100 levels of undo in this or whatever. So now that we have our keyframes, let's go ahead and on frame 1, we can leave it just as it is, but on frame 30, once you've created a keyframe, go ahead and just drag your shape across the stage. All right, and once you've moved it, you can then take the playhead, and by clicking the little area up where the frame numbers are that's kind of thicker, I'm moving it around. That's called scrubbing the playhead. You're kind of scrubbing through the timeline. I'm not real sure where that terminology comes from, but that's what it's called. And you can see that your object will move. It just doesn't fill in the animation between the keyframes yet. We're just set it to actually just jump from, so it sits in this position all the way from frame 1 until 29. And then as soon as it hits frame 30, then it jumps to the new position and it holds that until the end. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and save our file. You can go to File, Save, or I'm just going to hit Command S. It's always useful to do that often. All right, now we also want, especially when we're animating, even though we haven't done anything, any tweens or any in-between or anything yet, we want to be able to see what this looks like in the browser, in the real thing. And I think I shared this hotkey with you before also. You can publish it up here on the file dropdown, but to actually publish and have it open the default browser on your machine and set up a little imaginary web server so it'll actually run and work, you have to just hit on a Mac, it's Command Return, and on a PC, it's Control Enter. Hit that key, those keys, and that will build your animation, and it will automatically open it into a tab here. And what you should see is you should see your little ball just blinking from one position to the next. So go ahead and try that a moment, make sure that's working for you. And what it's doing here is it's playing the timeline, it's sitting there for 1 full second, and then it's jumping to its next position, and it's sitting there for 1 full second, but then it's looping. Just by default, these animated timelines will loop unless we tell them not to, which we'll get into in later lessons. So it's just right now, just continuously just going, you know, back and forth, looping, jumping back to the beginning. Easy enough. And sometimes when you publish and then come back to animate, you may see this little output window, and it may have some warnings. You don't have to worry about that stuff. I'll explain that later on. You can just close it, or hide it, or whatever, get back to the timeline. So now we see where the computer comes in handy. And instead of having to, so let's say I want some smooth motion between this, instead of having to pass this off to an intern and create an individual keyframe 28 more times and move it along, we can have the computer fill this in for us. Anywhere between the 2 keyframes. In fact, you can even technically select the first keyframe, you just can't select the last one because it'll kind of push the tween forward rather than to be in between them. But as long as your playhead is anywhere in between these 2 keyframes, you can right click, and we're going to create a tween up here. There's 2 types of tweens. There's actually 3. We'll get into the 3rd type later on, a shape tween. But there's create classic tween or create motion tween. Those are a little stronger for actual character animation and linear animation work. And I will show you how that works, the difference between the 2 later on. But for right now, you want to make sure that you're creating a classic tween because that is what is more conducive to interactive. So go ahead and click on Create Classic Tween. Once again, I just have the playhead or my selected frame anywhere in between these 2 keyframes. And I right click and choose Create Classic Tween. And what you should see happen is you should see that this little purple arrow shows up between them. And if you scrub your timeline, then you should see, sure enough, that it actually moves and fills in those gaps from one step, from one keyframe to the next. So now if I publish my movie again by hitting Command Return or Control Enter, now I can see, ooh, now I have this ball that's sliding across. So now for 1 second, it's sliding across and filling in that space between those 2 keyframes. And then it's pausing for a full second before it loops. Close that tab, go back. And that is the most basic sense of how to create some motion in here. Is, again, we had to make sure it was a symbol first, the 2 golden rules. 1, make sure it's a symbol. 2, make sure it's the only thing in the layer. So I usually match the symbol name to the layer name. And then we created some frames with F5 to give us some time and some space to work with. And we created a second keyframe with F6, move the position of the object, and then right-click somewhere in between and create a classic tween to fill that in. Okay, so that's the simple part, is making sure, I mean, it's simple once you've done it, it's several steps, but you've got a symbol, it's the only thing in the layer, create your keyframes, and then create a tween in between. Now, a very, very big aspect is what's called easing. That right now, if I take a look at it, this is very boring motion. It's literally the exact same speed from start to finish. It's kind of clunky, right? Now, motion in the real world, almost, unless it's an actual piece of machinery, almost never ever works that way. It will either ease in or ease out, meaning that it will either, the motion will either start out slowly and get faster, or it will start out quick and then slow down, or some kind of combination thereof on either end. But there's this concept called easing in here. And what you can do is you need to actually select your tween. What I mean by that is just click anywhere in the little purple area that it creates. Might be a different color on your screen, but I think by default it makes purple. And when you have this little purple area selected, look over at your properties panel. And as long as you're on frame, you'll be able to see this area where it says under, let's see, ease and effect. So it says ease, properties together, and then effect, it says classic ease. And then you've got this little edit easing icon, and you've got this little easing intensity number right here that starts at 0. We're going to leave the properties together. Later on, I'll show you the reasons you would want to keep them apart. And the effect, we don't want to deal with any of that yet. I can click on effect and see this classic ease, ease in, ease out, all these different things. Yeah, we'll come back to these things. We'll leave it on classic ease. And all I really want to do is change this number over here. All right, so we'll leave it on properties together. We'll leave it on classic ease. And this number 0 can go anywhere from positive 100 to negative 100. And I want you to start just by putting the number 100 in there. All right, so that kind of, when I put 100, that kind of changes the effect to read, instead of just saying classic ease, it says classic ease out now instead. And now once you've added that ease to it, now if we look at it in the browser, the motion is entirely different. All right, instead of just being boring and stepping across the screen, now the ease out means it's basically resting into place. So it starts out really quickly, and then it slowly eases out into place there. All right, now we'll be doing a lot of interface work in this class with, like, different screens coming up, different things fading in and out, possibly dialog boxes kind of sliding in from the side or the bottom or the top or something like that. Most motion on screens, inside of software, inside of apps, you'll see a nice soft ease, and a lot of times it's easing out as things are kind of sliding and moving around. So then the other way would be to go back into Animate, select the tween again. Again, you get to this easing by selecting the actual purple in the tween. Doesn't matter where, as long as you select it somewhere. And now this time I'm going to change this 100 from positive 100 to negative 100 for easing intensity. Now you can click on it and actually type it in, or you can click and drag, and you can actually see that I can drag between positive 100 and negative 100. So now I'm going to go back down to negative 100, and classic ease in is what it turns to. And now if I run it, now I can see it's the complete opposite, that it's easing in, meaning it's slow at the beginning, it's easing in, and then out, it starts to speed up, and then it really kind of smacks at the end like that. So it's very important to understand just the real basic nature of when you create a tween, especially a classic tween in Animate. By default, it doesn't have any easing on it, and you almost never want to leave it that way. You always kind of want to start with the ease out, less often, but sometimes you want to make an ease in, but you'll always want to have some kind of easing to make your motion a lot more realistic. All right, so let's try adding something here. I'm going to start with putting my ease back to 0. So I just have a nice flat, ball here. And now with our extra second of time, I'd like to actually move the ball back to its original position. So let's work on that. I'll show you how that works. So Right now we just have two keyframes, one at frame 1 and one at frame 30. Let's go ahead and put another keyframe at frame 60. All right, so I'm going to select frame 60, then I'm just going to hit Shift F, or whoops, I'm just going to hit F5, not F5, F6. Sorry, I did it twice in a row. See, I've been doing this for 20 years and I still make mistakes. I don't want you to add frames, I want you to add a keyframe. So an actual keyframe at frame 60, okay? Now, another thing I want to point out is you don't have to reposition, you don't have to adjust the position and whatnot on the keyframe before you set the tween. You can actually set up the tween and then move things around on the keyframes, and it'll automatically update and interpolate that motion for you, which is really cool. So we're going to do that in this case. This time, instead of moving this at all on this keyframe, we're going to go ahead and create another classic tween. So just once you've created your keyframe on frame 60, select anywhere in between the two keyframes. Just make sure you're in between them. And anywhere in between them, right click, whoops, accidentally chose the wrong one, right click, create classic tween. All right, so we'll get another purple arrow, and now we have no motion there yet. But because we've put it there, now I can actually bring the ball back. Now I could just kind of, I could kind of eye it and just kind of get it almost in the same spot. But let's say, just as an added little tidbit here, let's say I want to put this ball exactly where it started. So the exact same position that it was in frame 1, I want it to return to that exact same position in frame 60. The way we can do that is by looking at the properties panel and inputting the X value directly. So if I go back to frame 1 and just select my ball, I'm being sure not to double click it. If I accidentally double click it and go inside of it, then all my animation and my named layer and all that stuff disappears, because I'm now looking at a different timeline that's inside of the symbol. I don't want that. I want to make sure my little breadcrumb trail up here just says scene 1. All right, so I'm just selecting on the stage on frame 1, and I'm looking over here at my properties panel, and because I have it selected on the stage, it's showing me the object properties, and I can see the width and height. My particular width and height is 132, but I can also see the X and Y, 172 and 148. So the X value is the horizontal value. That's the one we're actually moving. So I can see that mine, I'm sure yours is different, mine on frame 1, the X value is 172. And then if I drag over to this other position on frame 30, I can see it's at 774, and it's still at 774 on frame 60. But what I can do, remembering that my ball was at 172 on frame 1, I can go to frame 60, and I can select it on stage, and I can actually change this X value in the properties panel. So I'm going to select that number, change that back to 172. That puts it where it started. And now it automatically fills in that, even though I created the tween before I positioned that object on the keyframe, I'll run it in the browser again, and it automatically fills in those keyframes between, or fills in the motion in the tween, even though I created it before the fact. All right, so now I have this ball bouncing back and forth. And I just want to play with it easy in a moment to make this a little more interesting, because right now it's a very robotic, boring robot ball. All right, so we want to make it an exciting, lifelike ball. So what I'd like you guys to do is just kind of, well, I guess you can just kind of do it with me. I want to play with a couple of different types of the very simple easing and see how it works. So let's say if we set the ease out to positive 100 on the first tween. In fact, I'm going to set it to ease out on both of them. Let's do this. So if I set, instead of it being just linear and just a 0, I'm going to set it to positive 100 on each tween. And again, we do that just by selecting the purple arrow area. And then once you have it selected, you can look over in your properties panel and see that little number next to effect, that little easing intensity. So if I set that to 100 on both tweens, then it's going to give me this effect, which kind of looks like pong, like it's being knocked back and forth. Rather than being so linear, it's at least speeding up and slowing down into the keyframe and being knocked back and forth. So it's different, definitely definitely a better animation. It gives a little more life that way. Now let's try switching them. So instead of positive 100 on each tween, let's see what it looks like to switch that easing to negative 100 on each tween. So again, I'm just selecting each of the two spots between the keyframes and just dragging this number. You can drag it, or you can type it in manually if you want. It's negative 100. Now if I test it in the browser, now it's a little different. It doesn't look like it's necessarily being knocked back and forth. Kind of looks like it's trying to escape and it's just getting up speed and then just slamming into a wall and having to turn around and go the other way, right? Now, what I'd like to do is try and get a good combination of the two, where maybe I do one that's in and one that's out, and get, you know, maybe get this middle keyframe looking nice and smooth in and out of it. So this will be the last thing I'll try. Try it both ways, actually. I'll start by trying the first tween in the first second. I'm going to have it ease out. Again, positive 100, classic ease out. And then I'll leave the second one easing in. Let's see what that does. That's actually what I was looking for. All right, so this looks more like it's on a string, like a yo-yo, right? Where it starts out, and as it hits that middle keyframe, it slows down into it, and then with the ease out, and then that second keyframe is set to ease in, so it slows back out before it, you know, heads back, and then it just instantly loops. So even though we're doing something as simple as just moving a circle, or if we want to call it a ball, imagine it's in the real world, on the screen, you can see the difference of how much you can affect even such a simple animation with these easing effects, right? That you can very much either have a robotic, mechanical looking motion, or you can have things have a little life to them. All right, I want you to go ahead and save your file, because we are going to pick up where we left off from this and do some more animation stuff in here before we move on to the next lesson. But that's really as far as I wanted to take it today. Again, we are building. It may seem a little boring. These are little baby steps. First, you know, but now we have 2 building blocks. We had symbols, or actually we have 3 building blocks. We had symbols, and now we have symbols and keyframes and tweens. And between symbols and keyframes and tweens, we can do quite a bit.